La Santé Prison, Paris, 1986. A woman in love in a helicopter, an accomplice using a rope and a gun, and the rescue of a man sentenced to 18 years in prison for armed robbery. A prison escape worthy of an action movie. This is the story of Michel Vaujour, a true story that took place in May 1986. The story of a man who became the protagonist of one of the most memorable prison escapes in history. La Santé Prison is one of the most famous and oldest prisons in France, located in Montparnasse in southern Paris. For more than a century, it was one of the country's main high-security prisons. For decades, it was the only prison located within the city itself. It served as a pretrial detention center for prisoners awaiting trial, a maximum security prison for dangerous criminals, and a detention facility for famous or political prisoners. Now imagine a prison where the walls rise more than 8 meters high. There are watchtowers at every corner, armed guards working 12-hour shifts, electrified fences, and cameras in every corridor. A place designed by engineers who spent years of their careers focused on a single objective: to ensure that no one could ever escape from this prison. Michel Vaujour was a criminal completely unlike the usual kind. He was calm and focused. He read philosophy books in his cell, wrote letters in impeccable handwriting, and spoke constantly about freedom. During psychological evaluations, he often surprised experts with his deep and philosophical answers. He was a man who used knowledge and language as essential tools to execute his plans. Yet at the same time, Michel was still a criminal capable of carrying out his crimes with a coldness that even investigators found unsettling. However, Michel's story began long before that. He had a difficult childhood. His parents abandoned him when he was young, and he was raised by an aunt who died of cancer when he was 8 years old. At 18, he was arrested for stealing a car, and that was when his comings and goings through prison began. But Michel never entered prison thinking about serving his sentence. From the very first minute, he thought about how to escape, and more than once, he succeeded. Nadine Ringon. Nadine met Michel through her brother in 1980. She lived an ordinary life before meeting him, while Michel was already a bank robber at the time. The two fell in love, and 2 years later, while he was in prison, they got married behind bars. Against all odds, they started a family and had 2 children while Michel was still in prison. When Michel was sentenced to 18 years in prison, Nadine made a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. Michel's sentence at La Santé seemed like the final chapter of his criminal career. It was a maximum security prison, and he was expected to serve 18 years behind bars. Everyone there had been warned about him. Every guard had his file. He was considered an extremely high-risk inmate, and for good reason. La Santé was no ordinary prison. It held some of the most dangerous criminals in France. But Michel didn't care. He attempted one crazy plan after another, all of them failing. The result was always the same. He ended up in solitary confinement, in a dark and isolated cell that only intensified his desire for freedom. Then there was Nadine Vaujour, wife, accomplice, and most importantly, a helicopter pilot. But at first, Nadine had no idea how to fly a helicopter. Still, that would not stop a woman truly in love from saving her husband, and so she did. Using a false identity, in mid-1985, Nadine began taking flying lessons under the name Elena Riggin. Her instructors remembered her as a quiet and diligent student, so much so that she achieved one of the best scores in her class. She continued to accumulate flight hours, renting a helicopter for 1-hour flights 2 or 3 times a week. She practiced low-altitude flying over urban areas for hours. She studied wind patterns over Paris. She calculated the minimum distance needed to land on a prison rooftop without being shot down before arriving. She was no longer just a desperate wife, she was becoming a field operator. While learning to fly, Nadine never stopped visiting her husband in prison. In every package, she brought small hidden pieces of paper miniature letters in which she described the escape plan, written in tiny handwriting. On her final visit, she told him the date and time of the big day. Years later, she would describe the moment herself. I had done something bold, something that had never been seen before, the day of the escape. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Michel was doing his part. For weeks, he convinced the guards that he had become calmer and more cooperative. Gradually, he earned small privileges within the strict security regime. He carefully studied the guards' patrol schedules and timed every gap in the system. Eventually, he identified the exact spot in the yard where the camera angles created a blind spot lasting less than 90 seconds. 90 seconds. That was all he needed. On the 26th of May, 1986, it was an ordinary afternoon at La Santé. The prison yard was moderately busy. Guards were making their usual rounds. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the towering walls, just like on any other spring afternoon in Paris. Nothing suggested that this would be the day when the security of one of Europe's most famous prisons would be humiliated under the Parisian sky. Then the noise began. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sounds of city traffic, but it grew louder and louder until it became impossible to ignore. Late that morning, at around 10:45 a.m., a white Alouette 2 helicopter, registration FGEF, flew over the roof of La Santé. Ignoring radio warnings that it was flying too low and too close to the rooftops, it hovered above the prison's third wing. In the yard, prisoners and guards looked up at the sky in confusion. No one understood what was happening. Within seconds, the pilot dropped a rope. From the shadow of a chimney, Michel Vaujour and Pierre Hernandez, his cellmate from the same block, suddenly appeared. They had reached the rooftop after spreading the word that they were carrying grenades. The warning was enough to keep everyone at a distance, allowing them to move forward. Where could they possibly go except toward the doors, the guards thought. No one imagined what was about to happen. Hours later, it would be discovered that those grenades were actually pieces of fruit painted green and black, an old trick used by Vaujour to distract prison security. On the roof, Vaujour quickly grabbed the landing skid and climbed into the helicopter. Hernandez, however, suddenly changed his mind. He stayed on the roof with his arms raised. He gave up. Within seconds, the aircraft disappeared into the sky. Minutes later, police found the Alouette 2 abandoned on a soccer field at the Cité Universitaire. No one was there. Authorities searched the area with dogs, collected fingerprints, and looked for any possible trace. The crucial lead did not come from the laboratory. While investigators were working at the scene, the helicopter's owner arrived to retrieve the aircraft. It belonged to one of the few Parisian agencies that rented helicopters by the hour. Investigators asked for a description of the person who had rented it. A man? It was a woman, the owner said, surprised. With that description, there was no doubt. The person piloting the helicopter was Nadine Rigon Michel's wife. And that was when the story took a different turn. What had seemed like a daring prison escape suddenly became a story of love. The wanted couple. After the escape, police surrounded the house of Nadine's mother, who was taking care of the couple's children. After 2 or 3 days with no sign of anyone, officers forced their way into the house. Inside, they found the grandmother calmly watching the afternoon soap opera. There was no sign of Nadine, Michel, or the children. They had already been taken away without anyone noticing. At the same time, the search spread across France, but without success. The couple had vanished. Even so, the story of Nadine and Michel was everywhere. Newspapers and magazines ran headlines ranging from "The woman who learned to fly for love" to "The most romantic escape." In that atmosphere, Nadine began to be seen as an unlikely combination of Bonnie to her Clyde and Amelia Earhart, the pioneering aviator. But Michel soon returned to his old tricks. 4 months after that legendary escape, on the 29th of September, 1986, he was shot in the head during a robbery and arrested along with his accomplices. At the hospital, he was identified through his fingerprints and tattoos. Soon after, Nadine was arrested. She did not resist. She only asked that her children be returned to their grandmother. She was pregnant again. She was tried and convicted for her role in the escape. Sources differ about the exact sentence. Some say 18 months, others 2 years. In either case, she served only a few months before being released in order to give birth. Michel underwent surgery and survived, but with lasting consequences. He was left hemiplegic, though over time he managed to recover some mobility while still in prison. The love story, however, did not last. Years later, the Vaujour couple separated. Michel eventually married Jamila Hamidi, a lawyer he met while in prison. In total, he spent 27 years behind bars, several of them in solitary confinement, before finally being released in 2003. In 1989, Nadine told her version of the story in the book La Fille de l'Air, The Girl of the Air, which was later adapted into a film in 1992. After the Vaujour escape, French prisons strengthened their security. Nets were installed over prison yards and courtyards, flagpoles and physical obstacles were added to prevent aircraft approaches, and stricter restrictions were imposed on low flights and later on drones around prison facilities. Yet there is a little discussed detail in this story, one that makes it both romantic and tragic. There was a third person involved in the rescue, the armed accomplice who helped Michel climb into the aircraft. This man was armed and descended by rope onto the prison roof. He secured the rope to Michel and provided cover while he climbed into the helicopter. In police reports from the time, the man is described only as an armed accomplice. Authorities never officially revealed his identity, or it was never publicly confirmed. That mystery makes the story even more intriguing. After years in prison and eventual rehabilitation, Michel Vaujour wrote a book about his own life. He also became a painter. In interviews, he spoke with the strange serenity of someone who had lived many lives within a single existence. When asked whether he regretted anything, he remained silent for a moment and then said, "I was always free. Prison was the place where my body was. It was never the place where I truly was."